Over the last few weeks, as we've spent time looking at the Psalms, we've seen many different aspects of how God deals with his people. We've seen expressions of lament and people struggling. We've been reminded of God as a God who is there as a firm foundation, a God who brings comfort, a God who is there, a God who knows us and who cares for us deeply. Real stories of real people in the way in which they're experiencing life and the way in which they're experiencing God and how God is there for them, even as things are hard. And we get an example of that today, where we look at Psalm 143, where we find David in distress and he's finding life difficult, and he calls on God's Spirit to lead and to guide. And that's particularly helpful as we come to this Pentecost weekend, as we remind ourselves of the pouring out of God's Spirit into the world and into our lives. So let's see what was going on in the life of David. Let's see how that relates to Pentecost, and let's see how that relates to us. As I say, he was in deep distress. He recognised that he needed help. In verse 1, he pleads with God to listen to his cry for mercy. He knows that he doesn't deserve God's help, but he just asks for it. He knows he needs God to intervene, to come to his relief. There is something that is going on, something that is beyond his ability to cope with, and he's looking for God to come in and be in that situation. If we go on a couple of verses into verse 3, we find that he's pursued by enemies. It's as though they're crushing him to the ground. There is something deep and dangerous going on in David's life. Have you ever felt like that? When you felt people were against you and you were under great pressure, when you knew that you couldn't sort things out on your own, when all that you could do was to cry out for help. In my experience, I wouldn't say that I've had enemies, but there have been times when people really criticised actions that I had taken. They were saying deeply hurtful things about me. It was hard. It was difficult to cope with. I needed to trust and rest in God, and that was not always easy. And there have been other times when it wasn't a personal attack, but I was faced with a problem I just didn't know how to solve. This was often in a work situation. We were faced with a technical problem that it just was not possible to address with the state of technology as it was at that time. But our customer insisted that we solve it. And sometimes by pulling together teams of people from lots of different disciplines, we were able to come up with a plan. And sometimes it just couldn't be done. And going through that process was wearing and difficult. And in those types of situations, we can often find ourselves doing what David did. We can look back on better times long ago when things were going well. We can take comfort in those times and gain confidence that things can be okay again. It does not always need to be like this. And as David looks back, he reminds himself of what God had done. He says, I remember the days of long ago. I meditate on all your works and consider what your hands have done. And there are probably two different perspectives here, two different things going on. And David's looking back in history to important events in the lives of God's people where God had acted in powerful ways. Maybe thinking of the Exodus when he had rescued them from bondage and slavery in Egypt. Maybe the time that he protected them through those 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. Maybe how he brought them eventually into that promised land and made it possible for them to settle down there, even in the face of opposition. Maybe he was even looking back to creation itself and the powerful work that God did there. Or maybe David was thinking of his own life and the times that he experienced living under the blessing of God, when he was able to protect his sheep from wild animals, when he was able to defeat Goliath in God's strength, when he was accepted into Saul's court, when he married and had a family, when he became king and experienced many blessings as he led God's people. Memories that would have helped, that would have encouraged, that would have reminded him of what had been and given him hope for the future. And in the situation we're in now, many of us are remembering things we were able to do before lockdown that just seems so long ago now. And we can also remember things in our lives, things we know about in the history of the church, where God acted in amazing and powerful ways. And this can give us confidence. But even remembering those times did not give David the relief that he was looking for, as the reality of his current situation was so real. And so his focus turns to the Spirit, firstly his own, and then the Spirit of God. He speaks about his spirit fainting in verse 4 and failing in verse 7. Sometimes we can feel physically weak, maybe after hard physical work or maybe after an illness. But there are also times when the spirit within us is weak, when we feel lost, when we feel that we just can't continue. This is where David seems to have got to, as he senses his spirit is failing, coming to an end, reaching a point of no return. And in that situation, he has nowhere to turn to but God. And so this is what he does. Recognizing that his own spirit is failing, he calls on God to guide him through his good spirit onto level ground, back to a place of safety. Teach me to do your will, for you are my God. May your good spirit lead me on level ground. This reference to God's good spirit only appears here in the Bible and in Nehemiah 9:20, where God's people were recognizing God's goodness and protection for them through their time in the wilderness. In Nehemiah, the people are recognizing how they had been disobedient, even when God was faithful, and so here they were coming to a time and a place of repentance. We don't know what was going on in David's life, but he knows that his current situation can only be survived if God pours his Spirit into his life, if he relies on the Spirit for guidance, for blessing, and for safety. And this is our realization. This is our hope as we recognize the ongoing work of the Spirit today in our lives, particularly at the Summer Pentecost. We recognize how the Spirit comes to help us to become more like Jesus, to teach us about him, to give us gifts and abilities to serve God in the body of God's people, to communicate to others. And we rejoice in that. We celebrate that. We want more of that. But beneath that, beneath the gifts, the abilities, the strength that God gives us, beneath that, and particularly important when life is hard, we recognize that the Spirit comes to bring life. This is what David needed to experience. It's important for us to experience as well. Paul picks up on this as he writes to the church at Rome. In chapter 8 of his letter, in verse 2, because through Christ Jesus, the law of the Spirit who gives life has set you free from the law of sin and death. Contrasting the old law and the demands of the Spirit, Paul reminds us that the Spirit gives life and sets us free from the things that would have dragged us down and eventually led to death. He goes on to contrast and to compare two different ways of living in verse 6. The mind governed by the flesh is death, but the mind governed by the Spirit is life and peace. He's arguing that our minds are either under the control of our own human desires, those same desires that led Adam and Eve to sin, those same desires that we are only too well aware can lead us into wrong and dangerous places. Or that our minds are under the control of God's Spirit, and that brings us into fullness of life and a place of peace. That even though we continue to live under the sentence of death, this is not the end, because of the deeper life that the Spirit gives. And he goes on to talk about that and rejoice in that in verse 10 and 11. But if Christ is in you, then even though your body is subject to death because of sin, the Spirit gives life because of righteousness. And if the Spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead is living in you, he who raised Christ from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies because of his Spirit who lives in you. What a wonderful picture that Paul paints of what God's good Spirit can do in our lives. The Spirit of the one who raised Jesus from the dead, the awesome power that was exerted to demonstrate that death had been defeated, that victory had been accomplished, that our salvation had been won. The power of that Spirit is living in us. That Spirit can give life, it can give freedom from sin, it can bring peace with God, it can bring the certainty of an eternal future with God. This, to borrow David's phrase, is the level ground the Spirit leads us onto. If at this time, maybe due to the current lockdown situation, maybe for other reasons, we're finding life particularly difficult and we just don't know where to turn, then let's open ourselves up again to the promised sent Spirit, and let's receive him again deeply into our lives. Let's not rely on ourselves, but rely on God, and let's live in the life that only he can provide. Let's remember the days of long ago, maybe some good times in the past when we experienced God's blessing in a powerful way, maybe just how things were before lockdown. Let's live in the reality of the moment and whatever that means. And let's do it in the power and strength of the life-giving Spirit of God. And let's look forward to the future that God, through his Spirit, will lead us into. For us as individuals, for our families, for our nation, for our church. God has good things in store for us. And he wants to lead us there through his Spirit. Let's receive him again. Let's live in his power again as he speaks to us about Jesus, as he gives us the gifts and the abilities that enable us to live as God's people and to do the work that God has called us to do. Here's some questions to think about. As you reflect on this psalm, as you think about what Paul wrote in Romans 8, as you remember the outpouring of the Spirit at Pentecost, what good things do you remember God doing in days of long ago? How does God's Spirit within you strengthen you in your life? And where do you think God, through his Spirit, is guiding you, guiding the church?